I'm not being corny. Illinois does have an official state vegetable now, but it's still without a budget. That's coming up next on Capitol View. There's nothing corny about it. Illinois has a state vegetable now, but is still without a budget. We'll talk about that on this happy half hour of Capitol View. I'm Amanda Vinicky, the State House Bureau Chief for Illinois Public Radio and WUIS, joined this week in inaugural visit from Matt Porter. He is the Capitol Bureau Chief for WCIA TV, and also we have Professor Emeritus of the University of Illinois Springfield, Kent Redfield, the Follow the Money man. So we'll try and talk a little bit about all of Bruce Rauner's millions sitting at that bank account and so much more. Of course, despite the plenty of money that Rauner has to spend on campaign commercials, brochures, what have you, Illinois has really no spending authority whatsoever. We're still without a state budget. There was some action, however, this week at the Capitol, the General Assembly in town, the House for 2 days, the Senate for 1, but plenty of activity in that brief moment in time. So beginning with this temporary budget, we'd heard a lot about it. Now that July is really halfway through, on the way to the governor's desk, a budget that would provide spending authority in some areas, at least, for this month of July. So, Matt, can you refresh a bit on the arguments that Republicans have for saying, no, we shouldn't be doing this, and then why Democrats do believe that this should become law?
Well, it's a controversial topic, obviously, whether or not the state should start doling out these temporary monthly budgets. Now, Democrats say we shouldn't, let people suffer while we're trying to negotiate a compromise. Republicans, on the other hand, say this is just kicking the can further down the road. And if we pass temporary budgets, then there's no incentive. To pass a full budget. Now, it is in the hands of the governor. It was sent to the governor's desk the other day. We don't know if the governor will choose to veto the measure as he has said, or if he may only veto parts of the measure. But the governor has the unusual opportunity of also just sitting on this budget. He did a temporary budget. It expires on August 1st, so he might just do nothing at all.
Now, Professor Redfield, this notion of a temporary budget, Illinois has been there, done that before. Why is this different? Typically, you would have legislators of all parties wanting to make sure that the state has some sort of spending authority. So why now are Republicans causing such a ruckus?
Well, because it's not really about the budget.
What?
in the past, it's been about, we've argued about it's a revenue thing, it's a spending thing.
Priorities.
Everybody knows we're going to get there. This time around, we've got, the other part of this is the governor's turnaround agenda. And so he is not willing to consider it a done deal in terms of funding state government until we get agreements on workers' comp, on property tax freeze, on tort reform. Those seem to be the main ones at this point. And within those, there is a lot of anti-union, anti-collective bargaining items that are either, they've been standalone, now they're part of the new pension bill. So there are lots of things that don't have anything to do with money. When you know that it's just about money, then everybody assumes we're going to get there, and we do temporary budgets and 1 month budgets. This isn't about money. This is about who's going to blink in terms of what the governor's non-budget priorities are.
It really seems like there are some significant dynamics that make this fight different. And number one is that it's not actually a budget battle at all. It's a battle of wills and ideology. And then there's also, as I noted, hopefully we'll get some time to talk more about the money, but there's the extra campaign side that Rauner has introduced. So you've got two big changes that really make this different than any other budget year. Professor Redfield, in terms of this, is the budget really the governor's only leverage to get his way on what Speaker Madigan has called non-budgetary issues. Rauner would say his turnaround agenda is relevant because it would set the path for growth in businesses, more people living in Illinois, and therefore you'd have more money to spend on the long run. But regardless of that fight, is this really his only leverage? And he has to stick to his guns on the budget, even a temporary one.
Yeah, because the Republican Party is in a huge minority. And even though now you need 67 votes in the House and 36 votes in the Senate for an immediate effective date to get things done, he still can't pass things without Democratic votes. I mean, it's going to have to be a compromise. And if he can't link those things, if he were to just agree to a budget, then we would agree to disagree about the other non-budget items.
So, Matt, what about this? When Republicans said that this is a piecemeal way to spend too much money, is that a honest argument, or are they just tossing it out there because they don't want to be seen as the one standing in the way of services continuing and employees getting paid? Is that a true argument or a fake one?
Well, I'm not sure. It seems like the Republicans are trying to be careful here because they don't want to be seen as the people that are taking away someone's child care or elder services. And I think that's why we're seeing, again, you've seen a lot of these present votes instead of no votes, kind of a way to say, I'm not for this, but I'm not voting no. And therefore, when people come back and look at my voting record, it doesn't look like I voted to take someone's services away. Really, it comes to a matter of how long are Republicans or Democrats going to stick with their leadership in this trouble? Because again, as the pressure builds in their own constituencies, how long can they hold out? And I think that's a game that Bruce Rauner and Michael Madigan are trying to play right now. And each of them thinks that they can hold their members for quite a long time, it appears.
Any bets that you want to take, either of you, on who will win that? Or is it following the leader, or are these true ideological policy matters that it's not just the leaders, but that the members themselves feel strongly about?
The differences are real. I mean, there's no question that if you're talking about tort reform, then you're talking about a key constituent group of the Democrats, which is the trial lawyers. If you're talking about workers' comp, you're talking about trade unions and other unions, a key constituency of the Democrats. But you're also talking about, who should bear the risk for when workers are injured, what kind of rights do people have in court when they are wronged by another person or a corporation. And so these are fundamental ideological arguments, and it's not just about spending more or less money. That's not, the governor said that's a core belief. Well, that I don't want to raise taxes. That's, he doesn't want to abolish government. It's just about how much government's going to cost. But when you get to these kind of fundamental issues or collective bargaining, then it's about really is about core beliefs. And to make this kind of what would be an equivalent would be like the Democrats asking Bruce Rauner to agree to nationalizing, or for the state to take over all of the production of energy, to suddenly Comcast I'm sorry, not Comcast, Commonwealth Edison and Ameren would become state companies, and we'd have a socialist, partially socialist economy. I mean, it's that fundamental in terms of the issues we're talking about.
Go ahead, Matt.
Well, I was going to say, if it was about dollars and cents, I think we'd be out of here and everybody would have gone home. We'd have a budget. But it's because we're sticking on issues that are so big political hot topics for Democrats. They can't say yes to all of these things. I mean, it would destroy their political bases. They're concerned, and I think that's why we're still here.
Well, and as noted, it seems like everywhere you look, there's some sort of union-related measure tucked into one of Rauner's plans, even those that not on its face have that. So property taxes or pensions, it's slid in, and that is such a core belief. Explain real quick. I think you got to why workers' compensation is a partisan issue and where the Republican and Democrats may fall on that divide. But tort reform, why is it that Democrats are aligned with insurers and I think this is maybe obvious, but the Republicans are more on the side of what many people would say the business side of that argument? Tort reform is just such a loaded phrase.
Well, and it's about compensating workers for injuries. And if you don't have a system like workers' comp, then you are going to have civil suits, and that kind of litigation takes forever. It's very expensive. And so almost all states have some kind of system of workers' comp where you have some kind of framework that allows you to arbitrate and to make decisions about how much, if an injury was in fact caused by someone's employment, and what kind of liability does the employer have. The problem is that Illinois has had a very liberal workers' comp system since the early 70s, because it replaced a very bad system when the Democrats finally got control. We've been paring that back, but we still have high workers' comp costs, partially because we have high wages. I mean, if you're giving someone a portion of their wages and you're a high wage state, then you're going to have high wages. Right now we're down to things like, what percentage of an injury has to be attributable to the employer in order to be within the system. If it's 50%, which is what the governor's is arguing for, then if it's 49.5%, then you're out into the civil justice system, essentially suing someone, trying to find a lawyer to take your case. And so, it's a question of whether the Democrats are going to be willing to give on lowering or raising the standard, I guess is the best way to talk about it.
Causation, when you talk workers' compensation.
Causation.
And then tort reform is when you get to the courts. And there's but moving on from that here, as you said, Matt, the governor said he won't sign the bill. He didn't say if he'd veto it or what he'd do. He could choose a portion of it, because we have state employees' pay is now part of this temporary July budget. This may be a way that Rauner has an out. Right now, employees have been paid for their paychecks that were supposed to go out midway through the month. The comptroller, Leslie Munger, Republican, appointed, one has to know, by the governor himself, sent out those paychecks right away. She has a downstate St. Clair County judge who's ruled that that's permissible and needed in order to not break unions' contract. But it's for all employees, not just those who are members of unions. The comptroller goes back and says that her system is so outdated that there's no way she can separate out union members versus non-union members, and that gets to why her argument for, in general, why she says she needs to be able to pay despite no spending authority from the legislature and the governor signing a budget law. She, in order to comply with the federal government and a federal law that says essential employees need to be paid the federal minimum wage, she can't figure out who's who and how much they get paid. That'd take too long. Illinois would rack up fines. She wants to be able to pay everybody. The Attorney General saying, sorry, no can do, separation of powers. The Attorney General is going to the state Supreme Court asking them to weigh in. So, Matt, what does that do? Just can you lay out the possibilities of what the Supreme Court could have and what that might mean for state employees who are wondering, when am I going to get paid and for how long?
Well, what it means is if you're a state employee, uncertainty is going to be your life. You're waiting to find out an appeals court if they still rule in your favor, and then if it goes to the Supreme Court, are they going to rule in your favor? And that is why you just mentioned in the temporary budget there is that point to pay state workers. Now, if Rauner gets into a hot spot where an appellate court or the Supreme Court says no, workers aren't going to be paid, there's no budget, well, he's got this now on his desk that he could sign. He could at least sign that portion and have state workers paid through July. And again, ease what we think is probably one of the bigger pressure points that he can have. If 68,000 workers aren't paid, well, people are going to complain, and I think that would drive people to the negotiating table. And something I was talking with Kent just yesterday is that if the Supreme Court, do they really want to get involved in this political matchup. And I think one thing we're going to think about is how long will they stay out of this battle before they bring themselves in and make a decision that could either force them to the negotiating table or prolong this, debate further.
What, because they themselves have to run for office for a spot on the bench? Does that play into this equation?
Well, they are subject to retention once every 10 years, but just generally courts don't like to pick winners and losers between the legislative and the executive branch, and they would just assume that this fight gets settled without them having to make a ruling. Now, they will ultimately probably take the case if this drags on, but nothing would make them happier than for this to get resolved. And right now, employees are getting paid until they reconcile the differences between the decision in a Chicago Circuit Court and in a St. Clair County Circuit Court on actually two very different issues. The issue in Chicago had to do with whether it was a constitutional issue in terms of paying people and whether you could differentiate between different kinds of employees to comply with federal law. The St. Clair County one had to do with unions suing under their contract provisions, which struck a lot of people as an interesting, legal argument. But so it's a mess right now. And if I'm, John Q. Citizen, I'm looking at this and saying, legislature doesn't function, the chief executive doesn't function, the courts are, all over the place. Is anybody in charge? Or, can anybody play this game? And that's very frustrating.
It's worse for John Q. Citizen, who's a state employee, because again, these are two very different decisions. We don't know what could happen. Comptroller Munger was able to process payroll this week, but that doesn't guarantee anything going down the road. The only thing that would guarantee it is a budget. Or a temporary budget.
Budget, or a Supreme Court ruling, but who knows if they'll take it or when that would be, no matter what the governor says. I feel like if you hear him, you might think, I'm going to get paid, but...
Yeah, and the last time we did this, really seriously, 91, when we got up to whether and some checks actually were not issued, then, if you're that state worker, I was working for the university at that time, and, I clearly, if my check didn't come, I wasn't going to be able to make my mortgage. I was talking to the credit union about a short-term loan. Some people have some, cash flow, and the university apparently has, university.
They get tuition dollars
U of I,
coming in,
yeah,
perhaps.
but if you're paycheck to paycheck, then, this is very, it is really real.
Why is there so much focus from the governor, the public, the media, on state employees getting paid, and not as much, it seems, on all of these social service providers who are saying, we're laying people off, our folks aren't getting paychecks. Some of them are continuing. I believe the Lincoln Challenge Academy, that's out in Rantoul. So for troubled youth, go to a sort of military-style camp to get their lives in order. Shut down for a bit, but now is running again. Nonetheless, the people who work there not getting their paychecks. So why the focus on state employees and not all the rest?
I think it's the numbers, right? There's just a lot of state workers, especially here in Springfield, and in Chicago, there are just lots of state workers. And if suddenly that large group just stops getting a paycheck, it's going to be a big thing. These nonprofits that are laying people off, it's terrible, and they're being vocal, but they're a smaller group of people, essentially, And, I spoke to people, a lot of the main services have to be paid, Medicaid, things like that, so there are a lot of nonprofits hurting, but they're a small group of people, so their voice is smaller. But if all the state workers stop getting their paychecks, everyone's going to hear about it.
And even though there are some unifying organizations for all of the not-for-profits, they are not unionized. And so that seems to make it a more organized group for all of these state employees where it would really be able to cause a ruckus. Moving on, because it's not just the temporary budget that Governor Rauner has, there's an opportunity perhaps to get some of the budget in place. The Senate did override 5 of the 19 budget bills, and they said that this was to cover either small agencies that really wouldn't be able to operate without a budget, so like the Human Rights Commission, the DCFS, the Department on Aging, state police. Yet the speaker had a press conference. In order for this to happen, the House has to do the same within about 2 weeks' time. Didn't seem like he was going for it, did it, Matt?
No. Well, he's concerned that he doesn't have the votes. And if he doesn't have the votes, he doesn't want to pull up that bill, especially when he said, if I call this bill to action, it becomes a veto session. People start getting paid extra money. People start getting per diems. And already the Democrats are under fire for this cost of living increase question that really haven't been given a good answer on. So I think Speaker Madigan does not want to call a special session, which brings a lot of baggage with it, to pass something that might not be passable. He might not
But he has a supermajority.
Yeah. But we know for sure that Representative Franks, who's a state representative from McHenry County, is, never votes for appropriation bills. And
He proudly said he hasn't in 10 years, with the exception of the temporary July budget.
Yeah, and he said that, and so he's on record. There are also some other Democratic targets, essentially, Democratic representatives who are very vulnerable, who have made a point of their independence from the Speaker. And those people are going to be reluctant to add that, to be part of that. And the Democrats don't have any margin in the House. In the Senate, they've got a margin. They need 36 votes, they got 39. They can lose 3 people. Democrats cannot lose one individual. If someone's sick, but more to the point,
there will be that issue.
Yeah.
We have
But if people have said, I'm not going to vote for it, then it's a pointless exercise. So you've got, once the Senate overrode the veto, then you start the clock ticking. It's 15 days under the Constitution. All of this gets us to the end of the month. So probably
and then we start over.
Yeah, the end of the month, all of the authority to spend money will be gone, whether we pass the temporary budget or not. The budget, the possibility of overriding the veto will be gone. Depending on what happens with the courts, then you're going to get crunch time, and it seems perfectly reasonable to assume that we're going to go into August without a budget, which is
shutdown could become reality.
Really, really amazing.
What do you make of, during his press conference, the Speaker, I'm going to read this quote directly here, when asked about how negotiations are going, and I know I'd spoken with many a Democrat, really, and some Republicans that said they're frustrated that leadership hasn't come together. And typically, when you get down to the wire and actually have a deal, there's a whole lot of meeting between the governor, the minority leaders in the House and Senate, and the Democratic Senate President and House Speaker. The 5 get together, come up with a plan, or at the very least, the governor and the Democratic leaders, because they're the ones who have these supermajorities. Speaker Madigan said, quote, I don't necessarily presume that there will be some kind of deal put together between the governor and the legislative leaders. And then he repeated that. What did he mean?
Well, I mean, we've asked him each week, have you had meetings? How are things going? And he'll say, oh, I've had a phone call. I talked to him, cordial conversation, but nothing that seems substantive. And when I talked to one of the lawmakers on the Republican side, who's, a leader, and I said, what's been going on? And he said, there haven't been these regular meetings between the leaders that you would expect at this point in time when you've got these negotiations. It's really been, erratic, and there hasn't been a constant flow of conversations.
So what if they're not having these meetings? What does it mean? Or what does Madigan mean by saying that he doesn't think there will be a deal at all? Does that mean that the GOP is going to be left out, that the Democrats will go it alone and override? I suggested that, and he said, we're not going it alone. We've tried property taxes like the governor wants. So could that mean we're never going to have a deal month by month? What do you read into that? It seemed like a big, significant statement, really.
The Speaker has, made a 40-year career or longer out of being kind of inscrutable. And so I'm not entirely sure, how much to put into that. It is clear they are not talking. And that is really serious. The last time that we really went to the cliff, when Edgar and Madigan primarily were fighting in '91, Edgar said, well, we were talking every day. I went down and had lunch with the Speaker. I brought him an apple. He was a cheap date, It was actually a very funny comment. But one of the problems here is that in the past, you've had people who are experienced in politics on either side of the table who have some sense of understanding, if not trust, of the other side. And that is missing here. I mean, it is not clear that Rauner understands Madigan and Collerton. It's not clear that Madigan and Collerton understand Rauner.
Or that they want to.
Yeah. And it's not clear that the governor, I mean, everybody kind of assumes you accept the political process. And it's not always clear that the governor is all that crazy about the political process. And
no,
so
he wants to, you keep on hearing, he wants to run it like a business, and that's what he's used to. And he's probably not alone. As you noted, a lot of people look at it and say, this is dysfunction, snap it together. But that's not how it works.
Well, I mean, the governor's fight is with someone whose name starts with an M, but it's John. It's Madison. It's not Madigan if he doesn't like separation of power, representative democracy.
We have a very brief bit of time left, and I want to kind of rapid fire through a couple of things. First of all, Matt, anything else that the speaker mentioned during his press conference, or also the Senate president did speak? He had a property tax combination plan that fell in the Senate. He said it was an offer of a compromise.
The property tax compromise that went in the Senate, almost thought that might be something Republicans could latch onto, but it was missing the key thing, which was local control. This idea that municipalities can sort of have this control over what local can be control, collectively bargained. Right, to reduce union power. And from the Democratic side, that's a deal breaker. And so even though they had a property tax freeze, 2 years, education to balance it out, it didn't include the local control, and that's a deal breaker on both sides. One wants it, one doesn't want it at all. I mean, and if that's where we're at, then we are no different than we were on May 31st.
Now, Professor Redfield, if you could give a quick rundown. We've had a whole lot of campaign reports and spending. We've got a heated U.S. Senate race, and Aaron Schock spending a whole lot of money out of his campaign account on legal fees. Also, Bruce Rauner has a whole bunch of money left. So, of that, what's the most interesting to you? And quick, tell me about it in 30 seconds.
We've upped the ante on all of these things. I mean, we have numbers that are huge. When you look at the governor's $20 million campaign fund, that just dwarfs everything else, and that creates a different reality. If in fact this completely blows up and we fight it out in the primary and the general elections next year, then that's going to be a significantly different ballgame than what we're used to seeing in legislative elections. So I guess it will be interesting, but the price of politics just keeps going up and up and up.
You can, however, get some deals on your booze. Illinois does have a new happy hour law that's been reinstated for the first time since 1989. And so that you didn't miss my joke also at the beginning there, that new state vegetable, sweet corn. So munch on that the next time you're watching Capitol View. Thanks so much to Matt Porter of WCIA and also the University of Illinois Springfield political scientist Kent Redfield. I'm Illinois Public Radio's Amanda Vinicky. You can check us out on Facebook at Capitol View Politics, and thanks.